Welcome to CivilNet. This is your host, Eric Hacopian, and we are honored today to be joined by a very special guest, a man who needs no introduction, Noubar Afeyan, well-known scientist, entrepreneur, and philanthropist, and we're going to have a discussion on multiple topics. Welcome to our show, Mr. Afeyan.
Thank you for having me, Eric.
Given your expertise on the COVID issue, it would be amiss not to start with that. So I wanted to ask you, this is a general universal question. Where are we in the fight against COVID? And where do you think we're going to be going? Are we working our way out of hopefully the COVID era? Or is this something that's going to be with us for many years to come?
Well, I think all we can do is give our intuition and our feelings about this, but the science is not clear enough to be able to make any declarations, unfortunately. Certainly the crisis phase of this seems to be subsiding, and because the crisis was a lot about people being hospitalized and dying, and the effect it was having on the medical care system all around the world. That definitely seems to be much lower and going into a manageable state. On the other hand, I think the virus and the mutations we're seeing are considerably more than what anybody expected, and I don't see that subsiding. So if I take all that together, I'd say we'll exit a crisis stage. We will be probably cohabitating with this virus for a long time, or a very long time. During that time, there will likely be variation in the virus. We will likely vary the vaccines that we have to combat the virus, and hopefully eventually it'll settle in to something that might be an annual type of boost, but we just don't know. That these are guesses at this point, because it is a fairly uncommon viral attack to what we had seen before.
Thank you. We're going to move on to a more Armenia-related question, an Armenia-Diaspora-related question. Obviously, you're a very prominent diasporan. And I know many people in the diaspora are watching, especially the goings on in Armenia, specifically on the field of foreign policy, whatever it involves talks with the Turkish regime about normalization, or issues that are being discussed with the regime in Baku in regards to demarking the borders, mutual recognition, and all those things. So I wanted you to see if you can articulate the concerns, the fears, or the questions that the diaspora has specifically for this government on these two very important issues.
Well, absolutely. It is quite a stressful period for all those who care about Armenia's future and the future of Armenians in general, whether they be Armenian of origin or not, because the level of uncertainty and the level of peril seems to be growing. And some of that is potentially an impression, because there's very little information that one can count on. Now, it's understandable, because negotiations tend to be secretive, and people aren't going to openly discuss these things, but the degree to which it's a black box is concerning, because at the end we may end up in a place that really creates a lot of division. So to be specific, questions on my mind, and I think many of those that I've spoken to, go to the basics of actually whether we have the ability to defend ourselves, to defend our territories, Artsakh and Armenia, because predicated on that is a level of acceptance that one has to have as to whatever is dictated to us. There certainly is a feeling that whatever agreements are being negotiated are largely being dictated, which of course is quite concerning. And then I think the other thing is vis-a-vis the relationship between the diaspora and the Armenian government, because historically in the 22 years certainly that I've been engaged in development in Armenia, but even long before that, there has been a mutualism that wasn't formalized. Certainly diasporans had no say in what the policy of the country was, but there certainly was quite a lot of discussion back and forth, so that there was the ability to suggest things, as well as try to help in different countries create the right environment to be supportive. For example, in the US, from an aid standpoint and from a geopolitical standpoint, that seems to have diminished considerably of late. And so one of the things that I would suggest that the Armenian policymakers realize is that while the current government, elected freely recently, can represent the interests of the present and the state, the interests of the diaspora and the interests of the future are predicated on decisions that are made today. And those two latter categories, the future and the whole nation, aren't really involved in any discussion that I'm aware of. And that's a bit of a problem as it relates to coming up with solutions that are lasting. So my biggest fear is that there can be accommodations made hoping for long-term peace and prosperity. But in fact, the way it's done creates the opposite prospect, because it creates the impression that these were done under stress, under the threat of additional war, to which my first question, can we even defend ourselves, becomes operative. And so that's the mindset, at least, that preoccupies several folks that I've spoken to. And yeah, there's more we could say, but these are things that can be addressed, in my view, if there was an acknowledgement that we're not just dealing with the moment and not just dealing with local interests of a government.
Thank you for that answer, Mr. Afeyan. I'm going to move on to a subject that you're very familiar with, which is the subject of economics and economic growth. As you know, we're sort of going through this schizophrenic moment in Armenia at the same time where we're having all of these serious geopolitical issues. It appears that we might have actually turned a corner when it comes to economic development. Specifically in the IT sector, we've sort of moved on from being a source of outsourcing for Western companies to a place where you actually have a very distinct and successful startup culture. My question for you is, how do we accelerate this, make the sort of the great leap forward into becoming a far more developed country and a far more developed economy, a far more complex one? And what role can or should the diaspora play in this transformation?
Eric, the IT sector is definitely one of the most important and bright opportunities in the future, and has been so for the 20 years that it's been developing in Armenia. And from day one, it's been heavily attractive to the diaspora, and the diaspora has played a very interesting role, in particular, bringing connections and experiences to the local environment. Indeed, over time, what's shifted is to go from an outsourcing model to a more startup product development model. And the skills one needs to do that are very, very different, most notably knowledge of how to create new markets, how to penetrate markets, pricing, distribution, things that if you're in the outsourcing business, you simply don't worry about. And so indeed, we're fortunate to have the kind of diaspora involvement in the IT sector. Companies like Pixart and Service Titan and many others have established 2 locations, one of them being in Armenia, and those bridges are incredibly important. So there's lots of good to build from. At the same time, as many have said, the challenge we have is that we need to have many, many more talented individuals in Armenia who can participate in this, because there's a critical mass issue. And that is education, that is career training, even after postgraduate career training. Many, many projects are spurting up to do that. I've been involved in several of them, because I really think we need to build capability. The other thing we need to do is to create a mindset, a startup mindset. And that's something that certainly locations like Silicon Valley, the kind of Kendall Square area in Boston, Israel, these exist in certain locations, and we need to have that emerge in Armenia. And it's really a mindset of courage and conviction, because if you're going to make a leap to create things that can really change the world, it really comes from within. It's not that you can read a lot of articles and do a lot of research and decide this is something that the world needs. Some of it is inspirational. Some of it comes from being convinced that if this can happen and that you can make it happen. So that too is a lot of collaborations where people can understand each other's mindsets. Now, your question also has a macro component to it, which is, what are the conditions in the country that would foster such a startup ecosystem? And there, certainly stability, having the place be a safe area to live and for families, young families to raise their children, people to come back and live in Armenia or move to Armenia, as we're seeing many from Russia and Ukraine do these days. There's a lot of context setting that falls squarely on the government's laps. And I would say there, there's a view that, well, governments should get out of the way and let the markets develop. That is certainly not what's happened in the US. I can assure you that the local governments in the US have created conditions that favor those types of companies to thrive in their location. Otherwise, they'd move. It's not very hard for things to move, as we're seeing now in the US. Miami is attracting people away from the West Coast and from New York. So that type of mindset that says we're all in this together, I foresee that being necessary and possible in the future.
Well, that was an excellent answer. But it segues into my next question, which is the issue of education. And I want to ask sort of a counterintuitive question, because we all know that education has value beyond its utility. An educated person is a valuable person, and it's not just essentially what you can earn from it. But from a very practical standpoint, how much of a correlation is there between having a successful education system and having a successful cutting-edge economy? For example, I'm originally from California, which has one of the worst public school systems in the United States, but that has not changed anything for example, in Silicon Valley, because you essentially attract the top 5 or 10% who will go where the jobs are or where the prospects are. When you look at it, and I want to look at this from an Armenia standpoint, as an investor, when you're looking at a country's education system, what are you looking for, and what is it the adjustments that we need to make here to become more attractive in the eyes of an investor?
Well, there's a baseline level of education that would be not only important for the workforce, but for the community within which these companies are gonna operate. That is gonna matter, and I think that Armenia has that, but is at risk of losing it if we don't continue to invest in it. So I think there's a baseline. Then within the sectors, you want somewhat technically trained people, and that is also kind of in the undergraduate level, but also on the graduate level, especially when you get to the cutting edge, for example, of machine learning and artificial intelligence or robotics or unmanned vehicles. All of these areas are going to require some level of postgraduate training. So the specialists matter, the general underlying education matters, the attitude towards education matters as to whether people consider it a kind of a diploma-seeking activity as opposed to a mindset seeking and also lifelong learning activity. These things matter, but you're right. It's not, an education does not guarantee, a strong education system does not guarantee a startup ecosystem, but the absence of that, of many of the elements that I described would be a counter indicator, or certainly would cause others to compete over it. I think the other thing that I just throw in here, just to be also a bit counterintuitive, is that education, when it comes to startup and innovation, isn't just about knowledge, acquiring knowledge and applying knowledge. It's also this kind of more nebulous factor of imagination, right? So rote education that just forces people to acquire knowledge turns out to be limiting in a startup world where you spend most of your time imagining an alternative world. You have to foresee that people are going to go online, create communities of millions of people, exchange goods, exchange advice, exchange, hate messages, whatever it is they exchange. That was an act of imagination that created, for example, social media. And similarly now with a lot of the metaverse and these are all acts of imagination. And so the question we have to ask ourselves is, do we have the right kind of education that allows for people to self-express versus punishes people if they don't just repeat the knowledge that they've acquired? And so that will come over time. But I think what you'll find in a lot of places where startups occur is that type of, sometimes people do that through startup competitions, sometimes do that through various incubators, etc. But that's another kind of education, real life education you need, so people are daring with their ideas as opposed to limited by what's already known.
Thank you for that answer, Mr. Afeyan. I'm going to move on to, this is the day of counterintuitive questions. And many of us, people living here and abroad, are very critical of the Armenian state government society. You can go on and on. But I want to sort of, put the mirror on the diaspora. There's a very compelling case to be made that what happened 2 years ago was a collective failure that included all aspects of the Armenian nation overall. If you were to pencil out what is the greatest failure of our diaspora over the last 30 years when it comes to the development of Armenia, what would it be?
It's hard for me to say one thing, so let me say a couple of just observations, and I'm not in a position to offer expert views, but I can tell you my lived experience in this regard. First of all, I would say that the institutions that existed in the diaspora before Armenia became an independent republic and also we had a free Artsakh, relatively free. The institutions that preceded them, I would argue, were diasporan organizations whose mission was to preserve diaspora in Armenia. I would say the difference in the Armenian language between Haya Bahbanum and Spurka Haya Bahbanum. We were involved in maintaining diaspora and Armenianism, not Armenianism per se. When the country became independent, it took a long time, even if it's happened now, for those institutions to reconceptualize themselves as being all about an Armenian nation globally that is completely centered on the state of Armenia. So there was a long period of apprehension, kind of foreignness, and at best we would visit and we would send aid, and then eventually started doing some small amounts of charity or investment. I say that because it took a long time. As a result, the culture of diaspora-Armenia relationship became, at best kind of a distant cousin as opposed to family. And I think that has profound implications because when we then observed a lot of challenges in Armenia as to governance and corruption and transparency and the way the media operated, none of us actually spoke up at all because we felt like a distant relative and it wasn't our place to speak up. Now, Eric, whether anybody would have listened or not is for another episode where you are less counterintuitive, because that problem has been a large deterrent to those of us crazy enough to think that people care what we think, but that certainly didn't happen. So I think that's one thing. I think that the second thing is that we never sat down and discussed what is a healthy relationship that can bring everybody together into a common set of objectives. Of course, in Armenia, you have an election system, you have citizenry. In the rest of the world, we're citizens of other countries. So everybody told us that's impossible, it can't be done. But if your future is threatened, it turns out anything can be done if you want to protect your existence in the future. And I worry that 30 years ago when independence was sought, we kind of felt like our future is not threatened. We just have to suffer a little while until things get better. But now, 30 years later, our future is absolutely threatened. And we need to have the discussions we never had 30 years ago, which is, can the state survive without bringing together some semblance of a kind of a global network of Armenians who wanted to survive and succeed? And if so, how do you make it kind of safe for everybody to interact and exchange ideas instead of feeling on the one hand imposed upon, which is what my Armenian or Armenia-based compatriots always tell me, or on the diasporan hand feeling like nobody cares what we think. That's a big, big undertaking, but diaspora definitely has not sufficiently at all played its role in raising this issue and trying to find a path forward.
Well, I think, thank you for that answer. And I think, the key phrases are institution building and state building, because they're sort of linked. And I think what we witnessed 2 years ago is the failure of 30 years of not institutional building and not building a competent state. I'm going to close with a very general, universal question. And you obviously have a vision of things that are much broader than Armenia. But obviously that world eventually visits us. Next 20 years, one can make the case that are going to be the most transformative 20 years, probably might be in, centuries. because we know certain things that are going to happen. One of them is the impact of climate change, which is going to hit every country in the world. In fact, the poorer you are, the worse you get hit. Second of all is the issue of decarbonization, which is a matter of certainty, and it's probably something that's accelerated by the events in Ukraine. We're going to have multiple countries that are very close to us that are going to go, from semi-prosperous or developed to quite poor very quickly, unless they're willing to make adjustments that almost none of them are. And all of this state collapse and all of the mass migration, all of these things are sort of like a tsunami that's heading the way of the world, whether anybody wants it or not, from the richest to the poorest. What features do countries and societies need, one, to survive this process, and frankly, more importantly, as with anything that is bad, it also creates opportunities to take advantage of it. From your universal views, what would you put your finger on?
If I was going to give a single answer, I would say the following: you can live in the present and work in the present and accept the future you get, or you can obsess about the future you want. You can debate about the future. And once you select the future that you want, that overcomes some of these challenges, for example, everything you do in the present is in service of that future. So I call this, you either live present forward or future backward. I think that if one chooses to live future backwards, and that right is always defined by what will be right in some future, that future orientation, I think, allows you to overcome present day challenges far more reliably than if you just take them one at a time as they come. And so if you look at transformative companies, they all operate future backwards. They have a much clearer sense of the destination than on any given day the direction. And the reason that's important is because we're living at a time when there's so much uncertainty and so many kind of heterogeneous sources of change and attack, that all we can do is to adapt and to be resilient. In other words, have enough excess capacity that we can deal with the shocks that are coming to us. The only time you do that is if you're planning for some future state, not barely getting by with your present state. Now, I understand that what I'm saying is kind of maybe more difficult to operate, let alone cooperate in, because who's going to choose that future? How are you going to kind of make current sacrifices? That requires leadership. So I would say, if you look, for example, at a country like Singapore with Lee Kuan Yew, they started in an extremely perilous starting point. And I can assure you, having spent time with him, and he came to Armenia many years ago with us, that his single obsession was a future destination, constantly changing, constantly moving it further and further out, not the present. He viewed the present in service of the future. I absolutely view it that way in my day-to-day work. And I think that leadership in any country needs to be oriented in that way, especially in this turbulent an environment. We know as a nation the path from surviving to reviving to striving. We haven't had a chance to thrive. As individuals, we have all around the world, but as a collective, we have not. But where it comes to survival, we have hundreds, if not thousands of years of experience. But what we need to avoid is the trap of survival. And the trap of survival is, I'd say, presentism. There's probably no such word, which is you obsess over the present. You shoot anybody talking about the future because they're distractions. And yet I would argue that the people who escaped the genocide, the people who actually weathered the toughness, all had in their mind a dream of what was going to be possible after. Without that dream, you don't put up the effort. And I think it's that dream that needs leadership, not soothing for the present difficulties. That's not leadership. That's just management.
Well, that's an excellent answer. In my experience, and you come from the world of business and science. I come from politics. Smart people in politics always bet the future against the past, And I think that's sort of another way of sort of a more cross-political way of putting it. I wanted to thank you for joining us, Mr. Afeyan. It was a wonderful conversation, and thank you for giving us your time.
Thank you so much, Eric, and always enjoy our conversations. Thank you.
This is Eric Hacopian, your host of CivilNet. Thank you for joining us this afternoon.